Hello, everybody. Welcome. From whatever country you're in, whatever time zone you're in, very glad you could join us today. Just a quick note that this panel will be published. There'll be live captioning available, so if you need that, you can find it on the link to the panel. And we will be taking questions after opening remarks. And so if you have any questions you want to submit, you can do it through the chat function or through Twitter, hashtag COVID-19Justice. I also want to thank, before we get started, Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute and the Human Rights Clinic at Duke Law, Just Security, and the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia Law School for organizing this panel and the entire series, COVID-19, Advancing Rights and Justice During a Pandemic. I'm Janlori Goldman. I'm from Columbia Law School and NYU Law. I'm moderating today's panel, and I'll open with a few remarks, and then we'll turn to our panelists who will speak for about 5 minutes or so, and we'll leave time for discussion. So please feel free to submit your questions at any point as we go along. For today's panel, we have 4 speakers who bring a range of perspectives to how we can flatten the pandemic curve while upholding digital and information rights. In this order, we'll hear from Adebayo Okeowo, a human rights lawyer with the Africa Program Manager with Witness, focusing on the intersection of human rights and technology. Diego Naranjo, the head of policy with European Digital Rights. Maria Luisa Stasi, the senior legal officer at Article 19. And Michael Pisa, a fellow at the Center for Global Development. So as a lead into our panel, I want to offer a little context setting, a step back from the temptation to silo all of our thinking solely around the current pandemic. Shortly after 9/11, I wrote a piece called Balancing in a Crisis, with a question mark, which was a call to resist the march of the national security state. I urged then that privacy and civil liberties protections had to be baked in from the start, given that in a crisis, we are often incapable or unwilling to uphold rights. I think now I may have been naive 20 years ago, because even entrenched rights can be swept away by declarations of global and national emergencies. So let me offer a few thoughts that I'm having now about where we can learn and how we may come through this. How can we protect human rights in this time when global and national security and stopping the pandemic is the dominant narrative, which obscures all other narratives and possibilities? In the quest to stop the transmission of the virus, we are traumatizing and doing lasting damage to our families, communities, jobs, and the social fabric that we rely on for our humanity and to survive. While a pandemic may have been inevitable, and there will surely be others, what is not inevitable is our response. The tragedy is that despite dire and urgent warnings from scientists and public health officials that we needed to put in place a pandemic preparedness plan, we did nothing. In fact, in the US, we dismantled systems and cut resources intended to respond quickly to a pandemic. So what could have been a mere public health emergency, dangerous but manageable, has now resulted in the near collapse of most of our social, political, and economic structures. Even the US election is at risk, ironically one of the most consequential levers people can pull to turn this ship around. I have a pile of government and WHO reports on my desk from the past few years, warning of a global pandemic and outlining steps we needed to take to prepare. Stockpiling protective gear, preparing testing for a large segment of the population, ensuring coordination between federal and state governments to share resources and guidance, and achieving greater equity for marginalized populations. The reports were ignored, our government sputtered and lied, and people are dying. We do not have enough tests, so we can tell people they have to stay home and only come to the hospital if they can't breathe. Because we are not doing wide-scale testing and collecting data, we're losing the opportunity to do the surveillance, contact tracing, and epidemiological research on COVID necessary to guide our response. Our data is full of holes. And because of persistent structural racism and inequity in the United States, Black people are dying at much higher rates than whites. Poor people are unable to quarantine themselves and are either being forced to work in unsafe conditions or are out of work completely and unable to pay rent or buy food. Our current handling of the pandemic is causing avoidable collateral damage. People dying alone in prisons and nursing homes and hospitals, people out of work or forced to work, rituals of loss and celebration made impossible, our physical connections to each other severed. So how may we emerge from this? The failure and collapse of our current systems offers a crack or a chasm where the light can get in, where we can disrupt efforts to build as usual. We can tear up the script and demand the creation of a society where government is held accountable to its duty to protect people. That is what public health demands. And yes, surveillance is at the core of public health, but it is essential we bear in mind that public health surveillance is distinct and must be kept distinct from law enforcement and national security surveillance. It is the conflation of these purposes that put us at great risk of undermining public health by making people lose trust and confidence in the very systems designed to protect them. For our most vulnerable people, our first responsibility should be to take care of them because they do not have the means or the freedom to do it themselves. It is not true that the virus knows no borders. It does show some respect for borders of privilege. As Masha Gessen wrote recently in the New Yorker, quote, "The measures we are taking to save ourselves from a global pandemic are changing us in fundamental, possibly irreparable ways. Whether we change for the better and the worse, as opposed to the solely catastrophic, will depend on how mindful we remain of the damage we're doing as we attempt to save ourselves from the pandemic," close quote. So let me telescope in now to our panel. As the New York Times said presciently in an editorial yesterday, protecting privacy is critical at this juncture, as so many of us are dependent on digital tools to continue working and staying connected as we sit alone in our homes. We shouldn't have to sacrifice our privacy to use these tools. So let me turn to Adebayo to get us started, and then we'll go to the other panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Janlori. Hi, everybody. My name is Adebayo. I work with Witness. And Witness is an organization that supports activists and community members to use video and technology in the defense of human rights. And in this era of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's become more apparent the value that video brings to the table. But at the same time, the greater risks that community members or activists or journalists themselves are faced with as they try to document the instances that are going on around them. Part of what we believe at Witness is that people have a right to record, and this is entrenched under the guaranteed rights to freedom of expression. And the UN has at different times also confirmed and recognized the right to record, which essentially means that individuals can go out and record law enforcement agents in the course of their duty. In addition to that, we believe that when people record these kinds of atrocities or violations that they may be witnesses to, they should be able to share those kinds of videos or images. But because of the instances that we're beginning to witness, particularly in countries around Africa, we're seeing how that right is being impeded and trampled upon. And I'll give a quick example. So for instance, we have seen in Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya, as with some other countries in Africa where there's been a lockdown imposed to be able to contain the spread of the coronavirus in these countries. And in enforcing the implementation of these lockdowns and curfews in some instances, governments have deployed their security agents to make sure people comply. In trying to enforce this, however, we have realized that many rights are being violated even further. And while you already have people worrying about unemployment, lack of food, or lack of basic amenities during this lockdown. People are, in addition to that, having to worry about safety from the police that is meant to protect them in the first place. So you have this balancing act where police officers are trying to ensure that people comply with the lockdown and stay at home, which is a reasonable ask. But in the process of doing that, there's a disproportionate use of excessive force in implementing that lockdown order from government. And as a result, we've seen journalists being attacked. We've actually seen some fatalities in countries like Kenya and in Nigeria, where people have been killed, all in the name of enforcing a lockdown for the COVID-19. And we've only been able to realize some of these instances because, or come to the knowledge of these instances because people have exercised their rights to record. So we have video evidence of police brutality in these countries being shown across Africa, and at the risk of those who are documenting it, as a matter of fact, because yet again, while they're documenting some of these atrocities, we see the state agents meting out force against those who have bravely tried to record it. We've seen journalists in South Africa being attacked. It's a question of why would the police shoot before asking questions? Because we've seen in South African example, for instance, a journalist with a news channel being shot at with rubber bullets. And she kept on screaming, I'm a journalist, but nobody paid attention to that before they got really up close, and she kept screaming, I'm a journalist. And then they said, why didn't you say that before? And she said, I was screaming that exact point, but that just buttresses the fact that why do our law enforcement agents have to react disproportionately, use excessive force, and ask questions later? We're lucky that that was not a fatal incident. But that's just one of the intersections that we have seen in the work that we do at Witness in this era of COVID-19 pandemic. And the other that I will just quickly touch on, and I could elaborate on this instances better later on, is in the era of misinformation. So Witness has been at the forefront of enlightening people to prepare for what we see as an upcoming problem around deepfakes and shallow fakes, where there's been manipulation of videos and audio to make people do what they never did. And we've seen this predominantly being used in the United States against some political figures. But again, we've seen a lot of women being targeted online where their videos are being doctored and being used to make them do what they never did. And this has resulted in gender-based violence, as a matter of fact. And in addition to the caution around deepfakes and problems that it might bring, we have seen how in countries around Africa, the bigger question is around shallow fakes. And with shallow fakes, you have problems such as misinformation, disinformation, miscontextualization of images. And that has been more prevalent now in the era of COVID-19 because everybody's pushing out all kinds of information and you can't tell which one is accurate or which one isn't. And it has led to a lot of fear and sometimes very extreme measures being taken by members of the public just because they did not know that what they've read or what they've seen is actually misinformation. So even when Kenya, for example, was imposing their curfew, stay-at-home curfew, and it was meant to start from the night time till the next morning, some people published news using a CNN banner that had Wolf Blitzer, stating that, oh, Kenya is imposing this lockdown at this period of the day because it's deemed that the coronavirus spreads more during the night. And as a result of this, we're beginning to see some governments beginning to re-emerge the conversations around control of social media in a bid to contain fake news and spread of misinformation. And that is a space we have challenged for a while and we do not want to get into. Because when you start having governments controlling what people can say on social media, it becomes a tricky terrain. So these are some of the things I could go into in more detail, but because this is just a 5 minutes initial statement about these issues, I will let my other colleagues talk about this and I could come back to these issues later.
Thank you. Those are very provocative issues. Diego.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to start my intervention with quoting Yuval Noah Harari, the famous author of Homo Deus and Sapiens and so on. He was writing in the Financial Times, and he was saying that temporary measures have a nasty habit of outlasting emergencies, especially as there is always a new emergency lurking on the horizon. He also added that when people trust public authorities to tell them facts about how to take care of themselves, citizens do actually the right thing without having a big brother watching over their shoulders. And that's basically our point. We saw a lot of quick reactions when the COVID-19 crisis started here in Europe. And for some reason, there was a quick push to let's have this magical technological solution, which is surveilling everyone for some reason. And we believe that that's probably not the best way to go. We want to respect fundamental rights and save ourselves from this crisis. We of course acknowledge that there are some ways in which technology can be useful, some data collection from citizens that can be valuable to prevent the spread of the COVID-19 virus. But of course, this response to this technological response need to be fundamental rights based and have at the core necessity and proportionality. I was listening to some experts this morning, and they were asking in another panel, well, should we do we need to balance efficiency with the privacy? And well, last time I checked, efficiency is not a human right. Privacy is a human right, and not efficiency. So I think we need to put things in perspective and listen to the experts. When I have one of the pinned tabs on my browser, always the World Health Organization with the latest news on the virus, and they keep saying the same thing. You need to wash your hands. You need to respect social distancing. You need to stay at home. And they have not said, at least up to a few minutes ago, please implement mass surveillance on our society. I don't think that's one of the things we need to listen to them. So if we need to use any technology, and then we would need to see if that is necessary for the aims we want to achieve, and then we will need to protect the data for now and for the future. We need to these tools to be open source, free software, so we can inspect them and know what they really do, and limit the purpose of the data for the duration of the crisis only. We cannot implement some exceptional measures, and now after the crisis is over, say, okay, just in case the next emergency, the next pandemic comes, let's keep using all of this data and tracking all of our citizens. That doesn't seem to be the right way to do things. And we have seen some more concerning, more optimistic developments regarding which technologies can be used. And the worst, probably, if it is confirmed, I have seen contradictory reports. Is one created by the Israeli state that apparently could allow domestic intelligence services to track citizens by geolocating them. I saw some other news that said that this app is only uses localized data on your phone. That's not clear. If it is true that law enforcement or intelligence services have access to that, then of course that's very worrying. Then about one in Poland, one of the smartphone app to combat coronavirus, in fact, pushes people, officials can ask individuals to upload selfies of themselves so they can, authorities can know where they are exactly located at any given time. And that's a mandatory use for everyone infected or in quarantine. In Spain, they have gone in this different direction, where basically you have an app that you can, if you have any symptoms, you can check one by one. And in case the app says, okay, you might have actually coronavirus, then they tell you to which health center in your region you need to go. And similar things happen in India, in the state of Kerala, in southern India. There's an app that gives you information about community kitchens for migrant workers, gives you information about home delivery of groceries, of food. And so those are good ideas. And now in Europe, there's a potential way to combat coronavirus with technology by using Bluetooth technology instead of GPS. So if you pass by someone that has tested positive on coronavirus, then and you will receive some notification. Everything is stored on your mobile device, and this data will not be transferred even to health authorities unless you want them to do that. And I have a few other points, but I know I'm already above 5 minutes, so I leave it for the next round.
I think, Janlori, you were on mute, but
I was. Thank
Give
you,
it me.
Maria Luisa. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, hi everyone, and thank you to the previous speaker for raising this very interesting point. As I was introduced, I work for Article 19, who is a free speech organization. So I'll try to give my 2 cents to this very interesting conversation, looking at the freedom of expression perspective, freedom of expression and access to information. I want to try to raise 2 main points in this first round, and then I'm happy to discuss other things. The first one is that if we look, this emergency situation has led a number of governments, an increasing number of governments, to declare the state of emergency and then to adopt emergency legislation. So taking emergency power to tackle this. As a free speech organization, of course, we need to assess which kind of impacts this might have on free speech, offline and online. So we do believe that access to information, accessibility of information in time of a pandemic are even more relevant. And they're instrumental to the right to health. So citizens, people, they can protect themselves better if they're well informed. So in this perspective, we think that the state, they are accountable, and they have the responsibility to try to do everything they can to make their own people informed and well informed about this. So there is a big issue of misinformation, which has been mentioned before. So we do realize that to kind of limit the spread of misinformation, especially the misinformation that can lead people to harm themselves, it's very important. But on the other side, we need also to remember that every kind of limit that might be imposed to the free flow of information, free flow of speech, need to respect some certain parameters, the parameter of legitimacy, proportionality, and necessity. And states, they cannot just overstep this because of the emergency. Because this won't work. It will erode trust in the institution, it will create a lot of confusion, and finally won't help people to protect themselves, and nor it will help the virus from spreading. Nevertheless, we've seen here and there that a number of emergency legislation adopted, they do contain provisions on the ban on false news or misinformation, vaguely defined. And some of them, unfortunately, they provide for imprisonment up to 5 years for people that are accused or are considered to spread false information. An example might be Thailand, where since 10 days ago, when this new emergency powers have been adopted, we have already had a number of reported arrests of people because of this false information. This is happening especially online. So one example is a 42-year-old artist that was coming back to Thailand from Spain, and he was arrested because he uploaded a post on Facebook saying that at the airport on his way back, there were no screening for temperature nor anything else. He was accused of false information, and he now runs the risk of 5 years, up to 5 years imprisonment. So this is the kind of false information that are being tracked and fighted by some governments. Another example is Hungary. So a European example is Hungary. Again, by coincidence, that emergency framework provides also for imprisonment up to 5 years, so the same amount of prison years, for false misinformation, again very vaguely defined. So the risk is the misuse of this kind of provisions, but we have to say that these provisions by themselves, irrespective of the use or misuse, they are contrary to international standards, because in recent time, 2017, joint declaration, the Special Rapporteur on Free Expression and three rapporteurs from different regions, they have stated that false information or misinformation should never be criminalized anyhow. So this is happening, and even if reason in terms of efficiency is actually, it is very contestable that this might be an efficient way to protect public health. The second, so we can question the efficiency in the short term already. Not to say that in the long term, this of course will undermine democratic dynamics within the population if we stop, if the government is able to censor which kind of information goes around. The second point I wanted to raise is about the platforms this time. Platforms are kind of reacting to the crisis by using increasingly more their artificial intelligence systems, so algorithms, to moderate the content. This is done for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is because people are in lockdown, so the majority of vendors, they usually do content moderation for the companies. They're not able to go to the offices, so they're not able to do this. A number of people, they are down with the virus and with the symptoms. So the workforce is diminishing, and this is a fact. So because of this, the big platforms especially are using and relying more and more on the algorithms to moderate content. Now, algorithms for content moderation, as we know, they have a number of limits. Which are all the more stretched when we talk about borderline content. So the risk here, and it has been admitted by the platforms themselves, is that we see a lot of over removal of content. So posts that they have no contentious content, or they won't create any problem, but they should be allowed under free speech parameters, international standards, they are actually removed. Because the algorithm falsely recognized them as fake news, false information or harmful information. There is also another layer, which is that these platforms, they're kind of broadening their definition of harm in order to broaden the kind of content they can take down. This has happened with Facebook and then Twitter, and then the others they have followed. So now what we have is basically the kind of a content, they can remove content that create harms, and harms is identified as anything that goes against the official advice of authoritative institution for global and local public health information. Now, this definitely increases the power of the platforms to control speech online. It does so to a certain extent, to an extent that includes also, in these specific times, political figures. For example, back in September, October, because of a number of important elections around the world, those platforms were discussing whether they had to fact check what was posted by politicians. They have taken different approaches, the different platforms, and some of them, they have argued they didn't want to fact check, because even if it was a fake news, it was part of the public discourse. So people, there was a public value to let people know that a politician said something. Now, the point is that what a politician can say or post can actually create harm to people, physical harm. If it's, for example, suggesting a homemade cure to the virus that doesn't work, right? So a number of these platforms, they have changed the approach, and they have said that they're going to remove this. And this has happened a couple of days ago, as we know, with Bolsonaro tweets and posts on Facebook about the hydrochloroquine. I'm not sure if my pronunciation is good. But anyhow, the point is that Trump tweeted something pretty similar a couple of weeks ago. So the idea is who draws the line, where we need to draw the line, and based on which parameters. Now, again, the answer is the platforms with their algorithms. And increasingly so, well, we still have, or we could have, the possibility to appeal the removal and try to demonstrate that the content has the right to be up. But these appeals, again, they need human workforce. So the platforms, they have already denounced that possibly appeals will take longer than usual because of the lack of certain workforce. So we are in a situation that is very specific, that is very complicated to manage from the platforms, but the solution they seem to have adopted is to rely more on automated system and to favor overreaction to censorship or removal, because they think that the trade-off between public health supposedly and free speech is this one. As a society, I think we have all the right to question this approach. And especially we need to question this and make sure that a short-term reaction is not going to be normalized afterwards.
Thank you very much. It would be interesting to see if we held our public officials accountable to the false information standard that's being built into many laws right now. Michael,
Sure.
close us out before we go to questions.
Thanks, Janlori, and thanks for all the organizers for having me. So just a bit of context and background before I turn the issues. I recently launched a project for the Center for Global Development where I work with support from the Hewlett Foundation. It was motivated by the fact that the development community has invested a lot of resources and energy helping governments, mostly lower income and lower middle income countries, improve the collection of data and implement digital services like digital ID and mobile money that leave behind a digital footprint. But it's done much less working with these countries and governments to manage the data and the risks that these systems produce. And the secondary goal of the project was to bridge the divide between the responsible data use community and what I call the more and better data use community, which includes those at the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, the United Nations, and a number of nonprofits working with governments to improve data collection and support evidence-based policymaking around the sustainable development goals. So the goal is to bring together experts from both communities and try to work towards a shared understanding of how societies can best balance the good that comes from having better information with the need to protect individual rights. And I think the pandemic and the policy response puts those questions in very stark terms. So I'm going to make brief remarks focusing on the debates around contact tracing, and in doing so, try to push back on what I think is some of the conventional wisdom. And I should qualify all of these remarks by noting I'm neither a public health expert nor a legal expert, just a humble public policy researcher trying to draw some strands together. So contact tracing, it's true that most of the countries that performed well in the early days of combating the pandemic had aggressive contact tracing protocols in place, and that often involved the use of digital tools. I think it's a familiar list of countries at this point. It's Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea. But the obvious point is that, of course, correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation. It's worth emphasizing that these are generally wealthy economies. These are wealthy economies, and they have strong healthcare systems. And they also learned many lessons through dealing with SARS, and in the case of South Korea, MERS. It's also worth noting that contact tracing is just one part of their policy response. And even though digital tools were used as a complement to contact tracing, they were used to varying degrees. And there was also a lot of hands-on detective work. So even after the crisis subsides, I think it's going to be difficult to determine how effective these tools really are. And doing so on the fly in the midst of a crisis is even more difficult. And so this lack of evidence makes it really challenging to establish which, if any, digital measures are necessary to fight coronavirus and what types of applications are proportionate to the threat that the virus poses. It's also true that these measures can be quite invasive. So the example of South Korea, which I'm sure many people know, but I'll go over rather quickly. In South Korea, the government, based on laws put in place after the MERS outbreak in 2015, has the right to collect and publish information pulled from cell phone, from telecom providers, from CCT recordings, from credit card records to monitor people activity. And then when someone tests positive for coronavirus, local governments send out an alert that includes information about the person's gender, age, and the names of the shops and restaurants that they visited before they were tested. So it's that's quite invasive, and I don't think most countries would be as comfortable as South Koreans appear to be, given the few surveys that have been done on the issue, with that type of practice. But I think the broader point is that we're kind of in the midst of the fog of war right now, and it's very difficult to determine what measures are necessary and proportionate. And given that, I think one of the questions I'd be interested in having the group consider is what are the appropriate parameters for experimentation in this period, and what is the right framework for policymakers to have in place to make decisions about that. So switching to the specific issue of contact tracing apps, which Diego raised, there's obviously a lot of interest in their potential right now, and I think a number of prominent epidemiologists have endorsed an app-based approach as the best way to scale contact tracing efforts. And they're arguing that this will be needed to contain the outbreak. That said, I don't think it's correct to characterize the public health community stance on this issue as one of having a cheap consensus. Just an example, former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, who's been in the news quite a bit lately, and co-authors argued earlier this week that, here I'm quoting, cell phone-based apps recording proximity events between individuals are unlikely to have adequate discriminating ability or adoption to achieve public health utility while introducing serious privacy, security, and logistical concerns, end quote. Given how much is being written on these apps, how quickly these apps are being developed, I'm not going to try to summarize the work in this space, but I thought it might be useful to point to two resources which I have found very helpful. The first is a paper from the Harvard Safra Center on Ethics called Outpacing the Virus, Digital Responses to Containing the Spread of COVID-19. And that paper compares different approaches, including both GPS and Bluetooth-enabled models, and centralized approaches and more decentralized approaches. It looks at them both in terms of their likely effectiveness and the privacy considerations they raise. Another great resource is a 20-page chart by the Future of Privacy Forum that compares most of the well-known proposed app solutions across a number of features. But to give my 2 cents here, my sense is that the excitement around these apps is a bit premature for 2 reasons. The first is what I consider a misreading of the facts on the ground, and the second is based on this issue of adoption. So the first point takes Singapore. I've seen many reports suggesting that Singapore's use of a Bluetooth-enabled contract tracing app, which is called Trace Together, has played an important role in its response to the virus. And that's generally used as a justification for the use of similar apps elsewhere. But I don't think that's actually the case. The government launched this app on March 20th. As of April 1, roughly 1 million people in Singapore, which is 17% of the country's population, had downloaded it. But government ministers have stated that for the app to be effective, it needs to be adopted by at least 75% of the population. So the app most likely has done nothing, had nothing to do with Singapore's early success in controlling the spread of the virus. But the bigger issue, I think, is adoption, or we call it the if you build it, will they come problem. And I think at the moment, there's a lot of kind of hand waving by proponents of these solutions on this topic. So the authors of the Harvard Safra Ethics paper, they did kind of endorse a Bluetooth-enabled approach for contract tracing, but noted that to be optimal, it would require the use by more than 70% of the population. And then they didn't offer any strategy for kind of achieving this 70% goal with a voluntary program like the one they're endorsing. I'd argue that in a world in which you have large groups of people who are skeptical of government authority, large groups who are wary of sacrificing their privacy, and then large groups, in the United States it seems like these days, who are skeptical of science, the Venn diagram overlap of people that would be willing to download and use this app will actually be very small in the absence of rather significant carrots or sticks. And then that raises the question of whether you make the approach mandatory, whether that's even feasible, and I'm not endorsing that, but it does raise that question. Or if not, what are the positive incentives? What are the kind of the behavioral economic nudges we're going to build in to use the app? So to close, I think efforts to establish these kind of what have been called digital participatory contract tracing models are noble, but I have doubts about their efficacy until we figure out the incentive issue. And I do think a more likely outcome is that we'll see more governments seeking to put in place powers like those used in South Korea that allow them to access more information about their citizens' digital footprint during a crisis. And hopefully they do this with a legal framework in place that limits use of these powers for combating the spread of disease, as you mentioned at the outset, Janlori, and also puts in place measures to unwind them, sunset clauses, so that they're unwinded after a health crisis is decided. I think ultimately the work being done around legal frameworks will prove to be more important than the work being done around developing voluntary tracing apps, which is probably a very safe way for me to end a talk being organized by law school.
Thank you, Michael. So just to take up on that last point, it seems that in order for us to have widespread contact tracing and to have that kind of adoption threshold met, we have to have testing, right? We have to have somewhat universal testing in order for that to happen. So one has to kind of lead into the other. And we see that we're really struggling with that here, at least in the US. Let me pose to all the panelists, and it would be great if each of you could answer it. And if you want to respond to anything that the other has said, that would be great. So it feels like there are two themes that have come out. One is that we need to build in certain levels of human rights protections into our law, and that they are inviolable. And as Diego mentioned, effectiveness is not a human right. And so when we're looking at balancing, not all things are equal. So we have that kind of one theme, and then we have the issue of enforcement of the containment measures around lockdown and travel restrictions. So which overcomes and in many situations supersedes existing human rights laws. So I want to just get you to talk about that for a moment. How do you see it's possible to hold on to those protections and safeguards that we've built into law, or that we're trying to build into law, in the event of a pandemic or some other global crisis? And how do we prevent the wiping away, sweeping away of those protections around enforcement, particularly around enforcement of these lockdown, containment, and speech measures, as Maria Luisa mentioned? I open it up. Who wants to get us started?
Maybe I can get a first go, just very, very quickly. I think there are two layers there. Of course, it's more complicated than that, but it's just, set the scene for the others to come in and say what they think. The first one is to try to remember that even for emergency legislation and emergency measures, we need to comply with international standards for the protection of human rights. So the basic questions about whether this is proportionate and necessary, and whether it is for a legitimate aim, the fact that it's limited in time and is subject to supervision, those are guarantees that need to be applied, especially so in pandemic times or emergency times. None of the fundamental rights we were discussing about, the human rights we were discussing a lot about, they're not absolute, they can be limited, but provided that we follow this basic procedure. So this is the main guarantee. On the other side, I think what is extremely important is the narrative. What we're seeing here is a very much like kind of war narrative that focuses on the danger and tries to hide, to polarize the discussion in between either rights or safety. Either privacy, free expression, or our health. This is not the case. It has been built in this way, but we need to push, as a civil society, we need to push for a different narrative to be in place, and to push for a dialogue from the very first step, thinking about different solutions, different possibilities, not undermining the value of informing people and trying to empower them to go towards solutions in this crisis, rather than surveil them and tell them what to do.
If I was just to jump in on that, so I was going to say that even in the context of an emergency, like we have with the COVID-19 pandemic, there are still certain rights that are non-derogable. And with the work that we are doing with empowering people to use video as evidence, we're beginning to emphasize the fact that even with the COVID-19 pandemic, based on Article 4, Sub 2 of the ICCPR, you cannot derogate from the rights to life or the right to human dignity. So all the excessive force being used, the police brutality that we're seeing being meted out against people who are flouting the rules is unnecessary and is disproportionate, and it's a violation of human rights, basically. And I mean, when we responded to this issue recently, the cases we're seeing across Africa especially, and we put out a blog about it and highlighted some of the issues that we're seeing and the response that should be given by governments. I also did a video about it. We saw some members of the public saying, oh, so what else do you want them to do? What else do you want the police to do? Would they not rather beat these people than risk the contamination that they have imposed the lockdown to contain? But that is not the right approach. You can't be beating up people, brutalizing them, in some instances killing them in the name of trying to enforce a lockdown. And in many of these countries, they have actually, through their emergency powers, also indicated the punishment based on the law that, okay, in some cases you made to pay a fine, or you will be put in jail for maybe a month. In Nigeria, it's for a month. In South Africa, it's I think for 2 months, and there are also fines that are applied in these instances. And we've actually seen that being imposed in the case of Nigeria, especially, where some people have been taken to court and have been made to pay a fine. The question of whether that is appropriate and adequate or is over the board is to be discussed later, but the point here is, even in implementing certain lockdown procedures, human rights still must be respected. That those that are non-derogable, like the right to life and the right to human dignity. And so we believe it's really unacceptable that governments will use the cover of enforcement of COVID-19 lockdown measures as another reason to further violate the rights of the people that we're meant to actually protect in the first place.
Thank you. Michael.
Sure. Maybe weighing in, pointing in a different direction, I'm going to quote Vivek Krishnamurthy at the Carr Center, who I read yesterday, and he was kind of asked a similar question, and his answer, again, quoting here, the international human rights framework recognizes the primacy of right to life above all others, and the enjoyment of many other rights, from privacy to free expression to free movement, can be limited to protect against threats to life, such as those originating from a deadly contagious disease. Now, I'm sure that's debatable, but I do think it points in the direction of accepting that there will be trade-offs to be made. I understand the desire, I hold the desire to move towards a balanced approach, but one of the things I noticed in the literature, particularly coming from the legal community on these issues, is that it's all about finding the responses that are necessary proportionate, and that makes total sense to me. The point I was trying to make specifically related to the contact tracing apps is there's a lot of uncertainty around what is necessary and proportionate in the midst of a crisis. And I think thinking through how do you rise above that uncertainty, or how do you have a framework for dealing with that uncertainty is very important.
Thank you. Let's hear from Diego, and then I want to follow up with a few of you from questions that we've gotten from folks who.
Yes, I think everyone said anything they had to say already, but generally in the case of the contact tracing apps, it's true that they require a very high threshold. But the other option that is being considered in Europe, and that seems to be the desired one by most member states, is to use geolocation data from telecommunications company, which is even more invasive. And they want to, of course, to use that for the future. So I think when you were asking us how to prevent this, well, we have to do the same what we were doing. We have to speak out. We working more even harder than before the crisis. We thought we would have all this time to do research, to read a lot of papers and stuff. Nothing of that. I'm busy. I see Maria Luisa also laughing. I guess it's the same for her and everyone else. And basically, we need to be quick as they are doing in promoting things that we don't like, and we need to tell them the answers are elsewhere, are not in surveillance, are in testing the population, are in having a strong health system, are in taxing the rich appropriately, so we can fund all of these. And finally, well, if there's any technology that we need to use, then find that one which is efficient. That's one of the parameters, but generally find what we can advocate as something which is necessary and proportionate, which is definitely not what I have heard from some member states in Europe.
So one follow-up, I'm taking a few of the questions and reading them together, is we often use these, the language and the framework of trade-offs, right? Protecting public health or protecting privacy, doing adequate and widespread surveillance, and respecting individual liberty and autonomy, allowing people to move freely, tracking their movements, right? I'm wondering if you can speak to whether there's a way that we're undermining public health by eroding trust in our healthcare system with these mechanisms. Can any of you speak to this or how you would address this?
Well, I can try to. I don't have an answer, but I have a couple of questions on on this. I think it's not. Well, it would be very, very difficult for a civil society organization to be able to suggest the right solution to this huge problem, right? What we can do is, again, to work on the process and say that we have the right to pretend that a number of possible solutions will be analyzed and discussed before we go for one that has a huge impact on a number of human rights. So again, it is not that we oppose to finding a good solution to the problem, because it's a common problem and we all agree that we need to find the right way to overtake it. But the point is, what we haven't seen, at least in a number of cases, is a sufficient discussion about alternative solutions, especially because there is a huge hype on digital solution to a problem that is not a digital problem. So tracing, or a certain extent of tracing, might be part of the solution if done in a certain way. And we have discussed this already. But it might not be the only one, and it's certainly not be the only one. So we need to focus and include in the conversation a range of measures, not only one measure, because it won't work. So yeah, this is what I think is missing in the public discourse now. And the feeling is that the conversation is captured by big players again, rather than being completely open to whoever can actually suggest something worth it to look at.
Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on whether we need to have this constructive trade-offs, or if there's a way to get away from it and to see the linking of the rights, individual rights, with public health? So let me ask another question, and this comes from one of our attendees. Given that strong measures are needed to both enforce and put in place contact tracing and to limit movement and to contain people during lockdowns, what would you suggest, excuse me, would be appropriate enforcement measures in those circumstances? I know we have a critique, but what would you propose would be adequate and fair human rights protective enforcement measures? And I think each of you, it would be great to hear from each of you on this.
I'll take a first stab at that, if that's okay. So the critique we've definitely had is the extreme excessive use of force. I would actually ask the viewers to go check some of the videos that have come out from parts of Africa, from Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria, and how the law enforcement agents have started to impose the lockdown measures during this time, and how extreme it has been. And again, we have heard the arguments about how these individuals who are flouting the law should know better in the first place, because it's the interest of protecting public health. However, I believe strongly that there are many other ways in just enforcing those lockdown measures that do not include violating the lives of people. I mean, people have genuinely been killed in some of these countries in the name of enforcing the lockdown. That is absolutely not acceptable. You know, we're fighting against the COVID pandemic because it's taking the lives of people, but then in trying to enforce a lockdown, we also kill people in that process. And there are many examples we could draw from where there's effective policing, there's dignified kind of policing. You could, if people resist, then go ahead and arrest them and prosecute them based on the law, but not resort to excessive use of force that sometimes takes the lives of people or cripples them in the process. There definitely can be a balance. We are not saying people should not stay at home. Definitely they should respect the law. But when law enforcement agents are also implementing and enforcing those laws, it should be with dignity to the individuals.
Thank you. Diego, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to basically say the same. I saw in Spain the approach that I've seen, although there's a lot of abuse by law enforcement agents as well over there, generally, what they have done more relatively successfully is to put more police on the street and try to tell people to obey the law and find them if they are not doing what they should be doing, which is stay at home, because especially in Spain, the system is quite restrictive. Here in Belgium, we can go out, apart from your groceries, you can go running, you can walk even in pairs, up to two people is fine. But in Spain, you cannot do anything unless, apart from groceries, and go to the doctor and few things like this. But the solution, as Adebayo was saying, having more police, which do proper policing, of course, with respect to fundamental rights and due process, that could be one of the solutions.
And to be honest with you, if you just look at countries, if you look at countries like in Africa, some people have genuine reasons why they're flouting those rules. And some of them is just because they need to leave. And when I say leave, they do not have a means to survive any other way but by being on the streets. And government hasn't made adequate provision to ensure that they do not die also out of the lockdown that's been imposed. And not to justify the reason why they should be on the streets, but just to recognize the humanity that needs to be applied when approaching these issues. There are many variables. And if government has not done its own part sufficiently, it begs the question as to how much you can expect the citizens themselves to do in such circumstances.
Yeah, if I can add very quickly 2 cents. I'm aware of a situation, for example, in Italy, where lockdown measures have been enforced to homeless. So homeless people have been fined because they violated lockdown measures. And this is, of course, unacceptable. So those measures, they need to be shaped in a way that they actually provide clarity and they address these specific cases. There's also been a lot of confusion about what was allowed and what was not allowed. And this definitely didn't help citizens to be able to kind of follow the rules. And the reaction was, the reaction of the state was, rather than focusing on providing more clarity, they were increasing the enforcement. As Diego said, they were also sending more police on the streets with checkpoints and so on and so forth. But the uncertainty remains. And this is, a basic principle, again, on the rule of law. If you want your citizens not to put in place a certain conduct, then you need to define that precisely. They need to know what is allowed and what is not.
Great. Michael, do you want to chime in?
Weigh in quickly on this issue of using digital tools to enforce quarantine. And I mentioned earlier that Scott Meeb and his co-authors raised were skeptical about the use of contact tracing, using digital tools for contact tracing, but they were also in favor of considering the use of digital tools for quarantine monitoring. And I don't have questions. I don't have answers. I have more questions. The question is, and the argument he's made, and he actually had a lengthy tweet thread on this yesterday, was that this is how public health has been practiced traditionally, that if you isolated or you identified someone with infection, you isolated them, and public health teams, I mean, this depends on the disease, obviously, but public health teams would then expend kind of effort to make sure that that person stayed within a certain area or house. And this, in the past, has been a very labor-intensive exercise. And the question he didn't pose, what I'm posing is, he was eager to do this by digital means, and the question I would pose is, what is doing this digitally rather than through on the ground footwork? What concerns does that raise? And I'm not saying this flippantly as if this shouldn't raise concerns. So I think if you do a lot of the same activities in a digital sphere versus a kind of a physical world, it does raise different concerns, because the way that data can be more easily shared and then triangulated from different sources to identify individuals. So I think that's a question that needs to be further explored.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I think, as you just said, Michael, and I think a number of you have said this also, in a lot of ways, we're pedaling very quickly to address the current situation. And we have not, as civil liberties and human rights activists, in some ways, we haven't done our own work to prepare, right? As I said at the beginning, we have seen that our public officials, whose job it is to protect us and to prepare for pandemics, we also have been aware of those calls and have not done what we needed to do in some ways. And so we're scrambling to catch up. But this conversation is hugely helpful. And I think it does raise a lot of questions, but I think those questions are important to help us frame where we're going to go from here. I know we're out of time, but I hope that folks will follow up with questions. This will be publicly available, and I hope we'll continue this conversation going forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Be safe.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.